Hi everyone. So we're back today with synthesis and introduction. So we're going to be looking at a broad overview of synthesis, including some ideas of how you can talk to your students about synthesis. What are the right questions? What are the right frameworks? What do you need to know? What makes this interesting? So I'm going to dive into some different ways we can look at synthesis, some of the main methods that synthesizers use to create sound and manipulate sound. So let's dive in and get started. So I often like to start conversations about synthesis with conversations about sound more generally. A great question you could ask your students is, how are we able to recognize the sound of an instrument? It could be any instrument, an acoustic instrument, doesn't have to be a synthesizer, but what gives it sound an individual characteristic? So pause on that, dwell on that for a second. What do you think makes an instrument recognizable? So if we want to give a word to that, it's timbre, right? So timbre is the character or quality of a musical sound distinct from pitch and intention and intensity. So distinct from volume, distinct from pitch. You can all have instruments play the same pitch at the same volume, but you're still going to be able to tell the difference between the instrument. The reason the same note will sound different on different instruments when played differently is timbre. It's comprised of multiple components, the most important being harmonics and overtones, which we'll look at in a little bit more deeply. This is a great graphic here. I have three different instruments, the bass guitar, a piano, and a trombone, all playing the same note, to low E, and sort of how that looks differently on each of the instruments. And we'll dive in the next slide into that a little bit more deeply. But even this is great to show students visuals so they can visually see how those sounds both sound different and appear different when we look at them in a spectrogram like this. So here's a zoomed in. We have the harmonic series. So when we hear a musical note played on an instrument, we can hear not just a single frequency, but the sum of the fundamental and overtones, also known as partials. Sounds have many overtones are complex and rich in sound. Sounds that have few overtones are described as pure or simple. So we have some recordings here. Here's a bass line on a very sort of pure sine tone with very little harmonic information. Here's that same line, or a very similar line, played on a very bright and buzzy synth with lots of overtones. Here's that. Definitely a big contrast there. It's not a different melody, it's different amounts of overtones. So the harmonic series, this is a great connection. We'll talk about soon the connections with STEM and with the connections with science. So the harmonic series is really the physics of sound. So it's a naturally occurring phenomenon of sound grounded in physics and mathematics. The harmonic series is comprised of a single fundamental and numerous higher overtones. Each overtone is an integer multiple of the fundamental. So say for example, we have a tone at 100 hertz. Its first harmonic will be 200 hertz. Its next harmonic will be 300, 400, and so on. This is simple math, and it's really kind of interesting because our ear is kind of detecting those close relationships, right? And it's saying, oh, that sounds consonant, that sounds related. Excellent. And I will also give a link to that website that you saw on the previous slide as well. So we can see here these different examples. Feel free to take this and show students this or create your own. I use the program Isotope RX. You could actually create these in Audacity as well. Audacity does have a spectrogram view. So we have our bass, our piano, and our trombone. So we can see they're each different. What I would do is show these to students and have them describe what they see. Are the harmonics really evenly spaced out like we see in the piano, right? Even distribution of harmonics. Or are they like the bass where you have a lot of energy at that fundamental and the harmonics kind of more quickly die away? Right after the attack, we see these higher harmonics die off, whereas the piano, they sustained. Right? The brass, this metallic instrument, you get a lot of these sort of non-harmonic tones that causes some of this blurring there, right? So all this like space, if you look at the piano, it's so super clean here. The brass, we kind of get a lot of space there. That could also be this trombone recorded in a very reverberant environment too. So these are great, and I love to, rather than explain like I just did in an in-person class, I would love to have you all kind of describe those. Right, and here's some of the things that I was just mentioning. Feel free to pause there if you want to read any of those. So the harmonic series in music notation. So we can see this is great if you have students, music theory students, or students that are comfortable with notation. It's good to like relate this to notation, so they build the connections as well, right? So we can see a note, we can see the next overtone is an octave higher. The next overtone after that is a fifth higher than that, right? This E to B, and then the fourth overtone is a fourth higher than that. So you see each of these times we're going up, the interval is getting smaller, an octave, a fifth, a fourth, right? What do you think is going to come next? A major third, right? And then a minor third, another minor third, right? And then a major second, right? And as they go up, they keep getting closer and closer together. You'll see some of these also are different than the sort of equal temperament we're used to. This third is slightly sharp. This fifth overtone is slightly flat. So this is a really great diagram that shows both how they lay more or less on the musical scale, but also the variations between these tuning systems of the pure overtone tuning, the simple mathematical ratios, and our sort of best of both worlds compromises that we use when we use standard Western intonation. So to summarize, right, timbre is the character, the quality of musical sound. Timbre is defined by the amount or relative volume of harmonics present in the sound. The harmonic series is connected to physical properties of a vibrating object, right? It's important to connect students with this idea that like if an object is vibrating and the physical vibrations of those vibrations, whether it's a flute or a guitar, cause that harmonic series. The lowest frequency is called the fundamental, higher frequency called overtones, right? They're based on simple ratios. Sounds with lots of harmonic partials are complex and brights. Sounds with fewer harmonic partials are simple and pure, right? So if you think about, you can give students the example, hey, what do you think has more harmonic partials? A B-flat clarinet or an alto saxophone, right? You could have discussions about that. Start to get them to think about maybe instruments they're more familiar with first, and then they can kind of apply these ideas to synthesis. So this is sort of how I like to sort of start to talk about synthesis, is talk about sound, right? Always relate it back to sound in the world. And then we can kind of introduce the synthesis methods one by one. So I like to start with additive synthesis after the students have had some experience with the harmonic series and maybe played around with some web tools that allow them to explore the harmonic series. The reason is that additive synthesis is essentially that. You're taking a bunch of different partials and you're giving them different amplitudes to get different combinations, right? The earliest synthesizers like the theremin, the Ons-Martineau use some form of additive synthesis, right? Even the Hammond organ is basically an additive synthesizer with some different parameters. So you're adding a bunch of partials together to build a sound. Each oscillator is building only one simple sine tone and you're adding them together. It's a very simple concept to understand. I'll have these links below. There's a web audio demo, great for playing around. Here's an example in a DAW of what additive synthesis is, where you have all these harmonics and you can sort of use these sliders to balance them out. So definitely check out those demos if you want. Pause this video, check out those demos to get a little bit hands-on. To keep things moving, we're just going to go through each of these as an overview. Definitely get hands-on with synthesis. It's the best way to understand it. It can seem very abstract unless you're playing around with it. So subtractive. So subtractive sort of starts with a more complex sound and takes things away to kind of filter it to get into that sweet spot. So here we have a sound source where we have a bunch of different partials all at equal volume, right? It's a really rich sound. And then we take this filter and we say, well, I want you to sort of emphasize these sounds here And after we get to that peak, I want you to start to de-emphasize and have that de-emphasis get more extreme as you go up in the frequencies, right? So we take that source, we run it through the filter, and now the filtered source has a different characteristic than the original, right? Think of this, you could say for your students, think of this like an Instagram filter, right? Where you're just taking that photo, it's the same photo, but you're just bringing out different characteristics, right? By emphasizing certain colors, de-emphasizing certain colors. That's a great analogy for analog synthesis. So there are some classic waveforms, right? Analog synthesizers do not have an infinite ways of making sounds, right? They don't have a digital memory to store a bunch of different waveforms. They usually will use 3, 4, maybe 5 waveforms that you can sort of toggle between. So we have a sawtooth waveform. You can see here we have a lot of harmonic information and a very gradual decrease in the volume of those harmonics, right? As we're going up over the octaves, we're seeing just a little bit of decrease, 6 decibels. A good note about decibels is that 3 decibels is what's considered a perceptual unit. It's really hard to hear anything less than 3 decibels, so 6 decibels is sort of 2 perceptual units of decibels. We have a square. Now look at this. It seems like this has double the amount of harmonics. So here we are only getting every other harmonic, right? The sort of in-between harmonics are missing, and they're going down 6 decibels per octave. And then in the triangle, much like the square, we are sort of dealing with the every other harmonic, and now they're sort of going down quickly, more quickly at 12 decibels per octave. So as you go up each octave, the harmonics are getting 12 decibels more quiet. So this will be closer to a sine wave, whereas this will be very different from a sine wave, very bright. So we have some, if you want to pause here, I won't read through these, but if you want to pause here, read through those descriptions, take some notes. These are the sort of 3 descriptions of the saw, square, and triangle. So far we've been talking mainly about harmonics and harmonic series. As we get into building sounds, we'll also want to think about envelope, or ADSR, right, which stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. Now, this is something that's very intuitive when we're making music with our voice, right? We can create short sounds, bop, or we can create long sounds, ba. I did that at roughly the same pitch, but the sort of expression or the intent of those 2 different musical gestures is very different, right? We have bop, 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 or ba, right? So if you have students that are band students or choir students, you can talk about things like legato, staccato, right? Students who are more, new to music, you can talk about, maybe play different musical examples and with different articulations and have them describe that. So, when we're music folks dealing with this idea of ADSR, that might sound super new to you, right? If you're not into synthesis, but think of this as articulation, right? If you think about staccato, legato, tenuto, all those different sort of types of articulation within the same instrument, right? Those are great starting places. We could also talk about like more generalized sort of each instrument will have a sort of default envelope. Like maybe have your students think about, well, what's the difference between acoustic guitar and a harp? Well, in general, a guitar has a shorter sustain than a harp, right? Because of the way it's built. The notes won't sustain quite as long. Or we could say, well, what is the difference between a bowed violin and a plucked violin? Well, in a bowed violin, you're going to have a slow attack, right? Because the pressure is applied gradually. And then you're going to have an almost infinite sustain. As long as that bow stays in contact with the string, you'll have sustain, right? So you can kind of break this down. I think, a lot of times physical things, the voice, instruments are great sort of discussions here, great starting points. But that's the other part of sound, right? So we have harmonics and we have envelope. So some subtractive synthesis techniques, multi-oscillator subtractive synthesis. So if you look at the web demos, you'll see most every synth hardware or software will have more than one oscillator. Why? So most hardware and software synths have more than one oscillator. Blending the sound of these oscillators and offsetting them by an octave or slightly detuning them can create a fuller, richer sound. A great way to think about this, right, is that organs, right? If you've been to a church or seen a pipe organ, like the one that was in the Macy's in Philadelphia, you see it have many different pipes. So when that organist is hitting a one single key, they can be playing notes of different octaves, different combinations of harmonics or octaves. So you'll see synths borrow this. They just take that from harmonic rhythms where you have your 2-foot pipes, your 4-foot, your 8-foot pipes, 16, right? With the lower numbers signifying the lower octaves. So you can have two oscillators an octave apart will create a fuller and richer sound that our brain will sort of say, oh, that's a single note, even though those are two octaves apart. Also, you can think about the sound of a solo violin versus a violin section, right? A violin section, all those players will be interpreting that note a little bit differently, and depending on their grade level, maybe very differently. So the sound, if you think about the Philadelphia Orchestra, for example, right, that rich, full sound of the violin section playing in unison comes from slight variations in tuning, right? Same thing with a synthesizer, that those slight variations can create a fuller, richer sound, especially if you run those two oscillators in stereo, and you can get a rich sort of stereo sound. There's also more advanced techniques like pulse width modulation. This is a way to change the size of a pulse or square wave, which will change the emphasis of harmonics. Another important part of synthesis is modulation, right? We only have two hands. So if we're playing a synth with one hand, we can kind of control one control at a time. We can grab one knob and move it, right? But what if you want to automate that change? What if you want to make a sound that sounds like this? Where you're changing the harmonic emphasis, sort of like throat singing. I'm not a great throat singer, my apologies. But you get the idea, right? You want to just hold that key down and not do anything, but it's going to go that we do very naturally with our voice. So you can use a LFO to modulate that. So as you hold that key, there's change built in there. So you have sort of a rate that you can set that will say every 7 hertz, right? Sort of cycle through the filter, or you could have it do volume. If you turn it fast, it'll become almost like a tremolo. So modulation is great because it's sort of this thing that can go anywhere, right? You can modulate volume. But we said we can also modulate filter. You can modulate pulse width, which will change the sound of your square wave. And I mentioned LFO, or a low frequency oscillator. Pause the video for a second and just a second here. Do you remember back to our discussion of sound? What is the limit, the low range of human hearing? Pause the video, think about it. If you thought 20 hertz, you are correct. 20 hertz, we cannot hear pitches below that. We can feel it, but we can't really hear it. So a LFO traditionally is an oscillator that produces frequencies between 0 and 20 hertz. Right? We can't hear that, but if we map that frequency onto another parameter, we can cause slow and evolving changes to that parameter. That's the idea of an LFO. Great. This is the point in our slideshow. As always, I tell you, take a quick break, grab some coffee, grab some tea, some water, whatever you need. We've covered a lot of information so far, but we have a little bit further to go. So let's talk about amplitude and frequency modulation synthesis. So we've talked about additive, where we're taking simple harmonics and adding them together. We've talked about subtractive, where we take an oscillator that produces a complex sound like a square wave or a triangle wave, and we use a filter to kind of trim off the parts we don't want or accentuate other parts that we do like. And now we can talk about ways of taking multiple oscillators and kind of doing some interesting and kind of wacky stuff with them. So modulation, the idea of modulation, which would be both in this frequency and amplitude modulation, comes from communication theory as comprised of two components. So think back to like radio, early 1900s radio. We have a carrier signal, a radio or TV channel, and a modulator, an information signal, e.g. a voice or video. So ring modulation, we're focused on combining two signals to cause changes to amplitude, to have the amplitude of that sound change. Basically, if you have sort of similar to a low frequency oscillator, but now we're using frequencies in the audible range. So we take that modulator and we map it directly to the carrier, we'll get that that ring modulation. So basically we get our sort of carrier, our main signal, and two sidebands, sort of a low and a high sideband there. Definitely if you're into math, you can dig deep into the math. I definitely do not expect that. What I think that you should all, thinking about your average, let's say middle school student, what they need to know about amplitude modulation is you can make robot voices with it, right? So this is the way that people discovered amplitude modulation, in the early part of the 20th century. By the 1950s and 1960s, folks at film studios were using this to create that sort of classic robot voice where you have the sort of main frequency of the voice plus a lower and a higher that create that sound of like sort of otherworldly. I'll put this link also in D2L so you can check out those robot voice examples. There's also some great guitar effects pedals like the Mooger Fooger that like has that sort of ring modulated. It basically kind of creates the sound like you're not sure where the pitch and the fundamental is. So it creates a very sort of ambiguous sound, which could be used for cool robotic or metallic sound design. Frequency modulation. So here is something that's super cool. A great connection if you want to connect, get your students' ears perked up. Frequency modulation was used a lot in classic video game soundtracks, especially the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo. Both were able to do some frequency modulation, which gave cool and more complex tones than you can create with subtractive or additive synthesis. So let's take a little bit deeper dive into that. So FM synthesis uses a modulator oscillator and a sine wave carrier oscillator. The modulator oscillator modulates the frequency of the waveform generated by the carrier oscillator within the audio range, right, above 20 hertz, thus producing new harmonics. These harmonics are known as sidebands, right? So we combine these two signals together and we get this resulting more complex signal, right? This isn't a sine wave. This isn't a triangle wave. It's sort of a wibbly wobbly wave, right? And that wibbly wobbly wave, for lack of a better word, will have a more complex timbre, right? Wave shape is relational to timbre. So FM, it's very efficient, right? Remember, if you think of the additive synthesis, you're using 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or even more oscillators to create a sound that at the end of the day is not even that interesting. With FM, you use two oscillators, you combine them together, and you get this third resulting sound that can be very timbrally complex. So it's often known for its specialty in creating bell-like sounds, right? Church bells or tubular bells or even gamelan, right? Because you're getting these interesting non-integer, non-harmonically simple relationships through the combination of these tones, we can get those sounds. Think back, to the sound of like the classic DX7. Which we'll talk a little bit about in our next video. That sound, that bell-like sound, is a great example of FM synthesis. Again, for those of you who like math, here is the formula for how that works and how the sort of relationship of the carrier to all of the different sidebands that you can have depending on how many different modulators you have. Feel free to pause that there. Again, this is not required information, but it's good to see these connections. Here's some examples. I had mentioned the DX7. You can see it down here. If you use Logic, you have the EFM1. There's also some guides to FM synthesis. Richard Devine, who does sound design at Apple, is a huge fan of FM synthesis, so you can check those out. Yeah. Send me any questions that you have. We covered a lot of material in that 25-minute lecture there. As with all the resources in this class, think of these as starting points for conversation, right? There's no tests in this class. There's no quizzes in this class. Either this is review for you or this is brand new. Either way, I just want to kind of spark these discussions, get these ideas flowing. It's okay if the 100% of this is not clicking right away. I think through doing the web demos and starting to think about how am I going to talk to this about my students about this subject. Start there. Start from their perspective, and then that will guide you to what you need to know. But yeah, definitely feel free to come back to this lecture, save the YouTube link, so even when you're done with this course, you can come back to it. It may take a few times before this sort of topic clicks, But yeah, thank you for watching today, and I will see you in the next video.